That's good. Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi, Maisres, Pei Gimel, Halacha Aleph. We're learning today Daf Chav Gimel, and we left off on Daf Chav Gimel, Mamish on the top. We would like to dedicate today's class, L'Schus, the Chas and Kala. That's Jakey Fishman, the Gabbai son, with Bella Shigalov. And just want to share that Baruch Hashem, since when we opened up the shul, we opened up Chabad Sola, we have been learning every day. But it was only, I think, 10 or 11 years ago that we began filming every morning. And the first time that we, traveling for a simcha, took along our filming equipment and we learned, which was great, was during Jakey Fishman's bar mitzvah in Eretz Yisrael. And I remember I took the camera and we went then to the opened, inaugurated Shula, Alta Shula library in Yerushalmi in HaKodesh. I remember learning over there in Yerushalmi. I also remember we didn't yet have the white backdrop. So as a Zajac and a connection for a circle, I also did not bring my white backdrop. So now you can see what's really behind, even though what's behind the person is very difficult to see. In any event, Hashem should bless us. First of all, Hashem should bless the Chassan and Kala, that they should build a binyan on the Yad, and that we should continue to go and celebrate each other's simchas, no matter where it is, even at the edges of the world, Begashmias or Beruchnias, as it is in this case right now in Florida. And while we travel, we should have the merit of learning together as well. Okay, so let's quickly recap where we're up to. First of all, on Daf Chav Beis Amud Beis, the Gemara brought a machlekes tanoim between Rabbi and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. The topic there was figs, sheyes nigmara malachton, figs that are going to be eaten the way they are, they're ripe figs. No one is planning to dry them out. The thing is that again, when you're not selling them, they only become kavua or koiveyad when they have one of the shisha devarim, which does include the iyas penei chatzar. But when the person, the owner, took it into the chatzar, the intent was not to take it in there for it to be eaten there. The person only brought it in there temporarily, passing through there. Rabbi holds, nevertheless, it entered the chatzar, it's koveya. And Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda pointer, because he holds that when is an iyas penei chatzar koveya, only if it was meant to be there on a more permanent basis, which would mean you're taking it in there to eat it in there. That was a machlekes. The Gemara at the end of Daf Chav Beis Amud Beis said, made a correlation between a machlekes amoraim that we had a few daf ago. One of the other shisha devarim is Shabbos. So again, if you have produce, simply by Shabbos Kodesh coming, those items may not even be allowed to be snacked from. And we explained Shabbos itself upgrades all of foods, which is allowed to be eaten on Shabbos because there is a mitzvah to eat on Shabbos. The fact that eating on Shabbos is a mitzvah, that in itself makes it chashuv koivei. Question was, the machlekes was, if someone harvested produce with the intent of not eating it on Shabbos. So they harvested it Friday, Thursday, Wednesday, doesn't matter when, but they had in mind to eat it Sunday, Monday, Tuesday after Shabbos. It's similar. Produce is passing through Shabbos, like in the machlekes Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. The produce is passing through the chatzon. Rabbi Yechanan is machmer. He says even though you're not planning to eat it on Shabbos, fact that Shabbos comes, Shabbos is koiveya. Whenever it is that you will eat it, you're going to eat it on Monday. You have to be tchayim u'ma'asin. You can't even snack from it. And Reish Lakish holds no, that since you did not intend to eat it on Shabbos, Shabbos is not koiveya. So it made a lot of sense when the Gemara said l'chu'ura that Rabbi Yechanan is like Rabbi, and Reish Lakish is leaning on the opinion of Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. That is where we left off. And on today's daf, we're going to start. The Gemara is going to show us that we're going to disentangle these two arguments. The Gemara will argue that they are not identical, that each Amayra, Rabbi Yechanan, can follow both Rabbi and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, and Reish Lakish can also go Sai Bein Rabbi ubein leRabbi Yossi v'Rabbi Yehuda. We will have in today's daf a very unusual, interesting application of the rule of kiven shehutra hutra, as we will see. I know this is a very generic statement, but we're going to apply it to our case. We will also refer back to a Mishnah that we learned together in the Sechtas Trumos regarding a person who was eating a cluster of grapes. Again, that was not yet, did not undergo its kivius lemaisres because it's not going to be merchandised. You didn't bring it into the chutzner/house. You're eating it outside your chutzner. But while you're eating from this cluster, you are walking and you enter the chutzner. That Tana, Rabbi Lazar holds that since you began eating it, when you were allowed to snack from it, that cluster could be finished even though you entered the chutzner and you can eat it in the chutzner. We're going to see how all of this will relate to our sugya. Now, going back to our Mishnah, Pei Gimel Halacha Aleph, the Mishnah spoke about a type of worker that is working, but he's not allowed to eat because of the biblical entitlement. But the poil made a deal with the balabas, with the employer, and because of his negotiation, in exchange of his work, he gets to eat. That is defined as a mekach. So that our Mishnah reviewed the rule of tseruf, which means even though it's a mekach, and mekach is koiveya, but there's a limit. If the worker is only taking one grape at a time, so he's allowed to eat it. Only if he takes two or more, where he gathered them, there is where indeed he may not even snack from it. We will actually, after going in a little bit about that part of the Mishnah gave also an example of a worker that was hired to work with olives. The Mishnah also made the same rule that you can only eat one olive at a time, same concept. However, the Gemara is going to bring up Baraisa, Tana Devei Rebbe, that for some reason will say by the case of the olives, that even if the worker takes two or more, which means even though there is tzeruf, nevertheless, the worker will be allowed to eat, and that will have to be clarified. And the Gemara is going to limit the case, the machlekes between the Mishnah and the Braisa, as we will see when we learn today's daf. Finally, if we get to there, and God willing, we'll get to there, something that happens on occasion. This is one of the reasons why in the past, lesser amount of people learned the Yerushalmi. We're going to have a Gemara that almost according to all opinions is not referring to Halacha Aleph. We're learning Pei Gimel Halacha Aleph. The Gemara here, it was probably mixed up. We're going to go with that. We're going to learn it anyways, where it is. We're going to have a Gemara that's going to explain a rule that we're going to have in the next Mishnah, in Halacha Beis. Just for the record, for people that are using our pagination, the next Mishnah is on Daf Chavav. One of the things we'll learn in the next Mishnah is that if you are walking on the road and you find right near a field that has figs spread out, you find a few figs on the road. In other words, circumstantial evidence is that these figs came from that field. Or even more, the Mishnah says, if you're walking on the road and out of someone's property is a fig tree, the fig tree is hanging over the road, and there are figs on the ground under the branches of the fig tree. So the Mishnah tells you two dinim. Number one, mutarais mishum gezel, that you are allowed to take it. It's not considered theft. And also, pturas min ha'maiser. That's the Mishnah Daf Chavav. We're going to begin a lengthy sugya that will be explaining that part of the Mishnah. We'll see how far we get, but at least we'll begin to address at least the part, why is it pturas min ha'maiser?
One at a time, or any amount?
No, pturas min ha'maiser means there's no kevius, which means kevani you can gather them. Okay, don't forget that the one at a time or two is only a leniency by mekach, not by the other ones. If I put something on fire, or if I put something in salt, or if I separate truma, we don't say, even though you did that, you can have one at a time. We only say that regarding mekach. Okay. So again, we had this initial correlation. Rabbi Yechanan kerebi, Resh Lakish keRabbi Yossi v'Rabbi Yehuda. So Zajac the Gemara, well, no, not necessarily. Yes, you're right. Rabbi Yechanan certainly can follow Rabbi. Rabbi holds that passing through to the chutzner temporarily, that chutzner is koveya. Of course, Rabbi Yechanan says when produce is, so to say, passing through Shabbos, you're not going to eat it on Shabbos. Shabbos is koveya. That works. But let me tell you more. Afilu the Yisbar ke Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbi Yehuda, even if Rabbi Yechanan will side with Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbi Yehuda in the case of a courtyard. by Rabbi Yechanan holding that something that's passing temporarily through a chutzner, that chutzner will not be kaveya at all. Still, Rabbi Yechanan has the right to say Shabbos is different. Chaymeru b'Shabbos. Why is Shabbos different? Let's read the words and then we'll see. Min hakotze el hakotze, out to explain it. Shekei nisharim, shenoshnu me'aleim asurim, if fruits or branches fall off a tree on their own, they become detached on their own on Shabbos itself, they are not allowed to be eaten. That's the typical case of muksa. Look inside the top of Maharafulda. The top Maharafulda, there's no divrei hamaschil here. Just begin reading. Umeshane hashas lo'olam afke Rabbi Yosef ben Rabbi Yehuda sfira leil Rabbi Yechanan. Narvos then the Shabbos chamur michatzon. Why? Because we find something unique by Shabbos. Shekain peiros hanoishrim me'aleim. Fruits fall off even on their own on Shabbos. They are rasurim b'Shabbos. Guys, the answer is from muksa. Just to know why they are muksa. V'chein eitzim shenoshrim men adekel asurim mishum muksa. Even though they were not shaken off or removed off by human effort, they fell off on their own. So just like we find when it comes to the laws of muktzah, there's no such a thing as intended, even if there was no intentions, things happened on their own. Muktzah. So here also, the Shabbos makes it tevel. Shabbos makes it kavua. Afilu shaloi medata. Shaloi medata is because he actually had in mind not to eat it on Shabbos.
Can you pre-designate it before Shabbos? In your mind, can you say?
Let me say to what you're saying, Kevin. Let me say like this. Many other achreinim learn the Gemara means to say the opposite. Only something that falls off the tree on Shabbos is muksa because of the rule that migu is katsoi b'bein hashmoshes. Is katsoy for the whole day of Shabbos, and these items were set aside not to be eaten because they were connected to the tree when Shabbos came in, and one is not allowed to biblically detach on Shabbos. But what the Gemara means to make the answer comes from what this implies, Kevin, to what you're saying. What happens if something falls off the tree by itself before Shabbos? No one even knew it fell off. There was not only was it not from human effort, there was no intent. No one knew it's there. You know what the din is? If my apples fell off my apple tree by their own before Shabbos, I am allowed to eat it on Shabbos. Why? Because it's muchan. How is it muchan? I didn't even know that they are here. No, since when Shabbos came in, objectively, these fruits were allowed to be eaten, so automatically it's considered designated to be eaten on Shabbos. I probably won't eat it. I don't even know that it exists. If I'll want to eat it, I'll be allowed to eat it. So therefore, let me just finish that here, that since even though before Shabbos you intended to have these fruits on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, in other words, you intended for these fruits to go through Shabbos without it being eaten, but you might want to eat it. You might change your mind. So just like when it comes to muksa, by food, according to everyone, you don't need to specifically designate it to be used on Shabbos. Muchan, by food, is if it wasn't excluded from it being used, it's automatically muchan. Same thing over here. Yeah, Yakir.
Didn't we just learn the opposite? You just read the opposite a minute ago, no?
I read the opposite because the Gemara is speaking about something that falls off the tree on Shabbos. So they learned the Gemara is implying only if it falls off on Shabbos is it muksa, which means if it falls off before Shabbos, it's not going to be muksa. No one even knew it's there. It's probably going to go through Shabbos. Doesn't matter. Fact that if you see it and you want it, you can eat it. It's muchan. Same thing over here, luchumra. It's the fact that you have these fruits, and if you want, you can eat it on Shabbos. It becomes Shabbos is kodeh. Okay, beautiful. Now let's go into the other side. It says back in the Gemara. So we already said Reish Lakish says that by Shabbos is not kodeh. So Rabbi Yosef ben Rabbi Yehuda says that something going through a chutzner temporarily, chutzner is not kodeh. That fits. So Rabbi Shimon Lakish, Avade can hold like Reish ben Rabbi Yehuda. But it doesn't have to be exclusive. I can argue that Reish Lakish, in the case of chutzner, he could be machmer. By Shabbos he will be mekel. So he can hold like Rabbi. And why will he be machmer by the chutzner? So we just learned a few daf ago. I know Machloikas Babali Yerushalmi, what holds it Rabbi Yechanan, but according to the Yerushalmi, it's a Machloikas between Rabbi Yechanan and Eish Lakish. Re'iyas Pnei Chotzer. Is it biblical? Is it rabbinic? From the Shisha Devanim, aside of Re'iyas Pnei Bayis, all of the ones that we mentioned in the Rambam time and again, all of them are rabbinic. Question is, what's Re'iyas Pnei Chotzer? And Reb Shimon ben Lakish was the one that holds that Re'iyas Pnei Chotzer is a biblical event, because he understands Re'iyas Pnei Habayis includes Re'iyas Pnei HaChotzer, which means food going through a chotzer, going into a chotzer, that's a biblical event. By a din doiraisa, we have to be machmer. Shabbos is koveya only midrabanan. So by Shabbos, Reish Lakish gets to be lenient. Beautiful. Let's read it inside. I'll tell you, by chotzer, he'll hold a lechumra kenebi. Why? Because chomer hu b'chatzar beishmira. Rabbi Yechanan was the one that said it's only midrabanan. He said that mekach and chotzer, chotzer, that is a beis shemira. It's not any chotzer, but even the chotzer and Shabbos, they're not enam toiram. I know they're only mentioning 3. We keep on saying it's all the 5. It's really all the 6. If chotzer is separate, However, Rav Imi says Shem ben Lakish hamachuver shebekulam. The one that's most effective from the 3 that you mentioned, Mekach, chotzer, and Shabbos, Zachatzar beis hashmira. Why is it the most effective? Because Reish Lakish is of the opinion that Re'iyas Pnei Chotzer is a midoraisa dika event that will establish a kvius. So that's why it makes perfect sense to be machmer by a doiraisa and to be mekel by a derabbanan. Okay. Now that we mentioned again, we are still in the middle of this machlokes Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. All right, you have produce. You don't plan to eat it in the chutzner, you're taking it through the chutzner. Therefore, he says, pointed means you can snack from it. You don't have to be toidim u'ma'ased prior to snacking. So let's go and quote the following. That Rabbi Yechanan b'shem Rab Shimon ben Yochai. Listen to this, guys. It's amazing. If a person has 2 chatzeders, achaz b'migdala va'achaz b'teveria. I just want to say, maybe b'lashon sachas, that there is now a part of the brain that's called the amygdala. The amygdala is the part of the brain that perceives threats. So people that are anxious have a very overworking amygdala. That's what tells the person you have to go into flight or fight. That's the amygdala. That's when you go into what's the opposite of the amygdala? How do you calm yourself down? You have to be calm. I know that Tveria, Iraq Kodesh, they say the 4 holy cities are connected to Eish, Ruach, Mayim, and Afar. Tveria is the city of Mayim. Water is calming. Relative to the Holy Land, Nestama, one of the most calming places to live, relative to Eretz Yisrael, is probably Tveria. Calm. So it's interesting that you have, these are the 2 opposites. So anyways, coming back. So a guy has 2 chatzes, one in Migdala and one in Tveria. The amygdala, correct. And now listen to this. This guy took some figs or any other produce, and he'aviram bezusha b'amygdala. For whatever reason, he went to visit his house in Amygdala, and he took the produce into the chutzner. He wasn't planning to eat it there. His intent was, after he does whatever he needs to do, he has to shut off the water there, he has to put on whatever he needs to do there, he's going to go and eat it in Tveria. According to Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, this is the case. Even though he brought it into his chutzner, since from the outset his intention was not to eat it in this amygdala, okay, so then it was no problem. You can still snack on it. Now Rab Shimon bar Yochai says a chiddush. Even when he brings it into the chutzner in Tveria, which is where he plans to eat it, that chutzner will also not be koiveya it. Kiven shehutra hutra. Once, because of the halachic reasons that we just mentioned, temporarily going through the chutzner, chutzner no longer had the power to establish kvius. For this produce, no chutzner will establish kvius. It became desensitized to chutzner. Let's read it inside. Because you brought it into the chutzner migdal. Your intention is to eat it in Tveria. Since when it went through the first courtyard, That first courtyard did not make a kvius. It's still mutter to eat it. I mean, we're going according to Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. So now, even when you take it into the courtyard in Tiberia and you plan to eat it there, mutter, you can still eat it there. Like I said the words in the intro, kivan shehutra hutra, a gewaldige concept. You disempowered chatzik.
Does it have anything to do with where's the primary residence?
No, b'chlal not. This goes back to the core of why should something be koiveya it. God said that iyas pnei bayis. Hashem said that. Okay, why are we adding other things? Because it's machshavit. If you enter the chutzner, we already showed you that chutzner was not machshav, even though there's a reason because you weren't planning to stay there. You took away the koyach of chutzner. Says the Gemara like this: that first of all, Asya Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, this rule of the Tana of the Rashbi is predicated on him holding like Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, that when some produce is taken through a chutzner temporarily, that chutzner will not be koiveya it. However, he's going beyond that. Veruba min the Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. He's going beyond that. Ma do Amar Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, because all Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda said is that when you take it through a chutzner temporarily, in that chutzner, you will still be allowed to eat it. But he never spoke about you later taking that produce into a chutzner permanently. He never spoke about that. However, Uma the Amar of Shimon Bar Yochai is even ba'omed b'makim chiyuv. Okay, and now that one that he holds, once you habituated, once you familiarize this produce that chutzner doesn't have an effect, no chutzner will have an effect. It's mamish gavaldik. Says the Gemara, I want you to know. So you have Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, step number one. Step number two is a bigger novelty, Lakula, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Be'emes, you can go in this derech, on this path. There's a step number three. And the step number three is the Mishnah that we quoted in the intro from Masechta Trumos. Here we're speaking about someone who was only entering one chutzner, plans to be in that chutzner, but he began to eat a cluster of grapes prior to entering the chutzner. And we had a Mishnah in Masechta Trumos where the Tana Rabbi Elazar says that since you began eating from this cluster before entering the chutzner, that cluster will remain permitted even when you enter the chutzner. That's even more than the Rashbi. The Rabbi Eliezer is even Ruba min Tarvayon. The Rabbi Eliezer Omar. You're going to be mutar. Now, what's very interesting, what's very insightful, I understand that Rabbi Eliezer is more lenient than Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But to link this Rabbi Eliezer with our Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, that's a big chiddush of the Gemara now. He's more lenient than both. You can argue Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda never spoke about such a thing. But he did. He did. In other words, the underlying rule of Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, who is lenient, all of this points to the fact that chutzner is not such a koiveya like the others. Basically, the opposite of Reish Lakish, that holds that chatzar beis hashmira as a doiraisa. They bechlal view it as something weak. Since it's something weak, there's a lot of room for leniency. And this will be the ultimate leniency. You enter the chutzner. But we're saying, the man already began eating these grapes, only that cluster. But that cluster you can finish. You entered the chutzner. Chutzner to begin with is a weak event. The iyas pnei chutzner. And since you began, the concept of kivan shehutra hutra, since you began eating that cluster, you can continue and conclude.
Does that go by one apple or a bunch of apples then?
I would say only by grapes, if I understand it, by one cluster. I don't think that two apples are like one cluster.
But apples are a bunch.
I would say, okay, but very good. I would say that if I'm eating an apple, and in the middle of eating the apple, I enter my chutzner, Rabbi Eliezer will hold, I can finish eating the apple. That will be a good correlation.
Just that one apple. Okay.
That one apple. Very good. Very good. Okay. This is amazing. We're going back to the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah spoke about Hamoitzi Poi Aleph. The Mishnah spoke specifically about a case where the poil does not have a biblical entitlement, but he negotiated with the employer, and because of his deal with the employer, he has the right to eat. One example that we gave was that he's not even working with detached produce. He's only working with attached produce. So therefore, midoraisa, he's not allowed to eat. So, but now that he's allowed to eat because of his deal, so step one, step two. Step one is, well, that's called a mekach. Mekach is, it makes a kvius. However, going back to Rav Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, we already said that cool, even according to Rav Meir, even when there is a mekach, even according to Rav Meir, if the worker is the one that's taking it, that's what we said in the previous chapter. If he only takes it one at a time, if there's no tzeduf, there's no togetherness, then mekach is not koiveya. So then the Mishnah said, but the worker cannot take it even one at a time if those items were put in a sal, v'loy min asal, v'loy min hakupais, v'loy min hamuktzah. That is the words of the Mishnah. And it makes sense, because even though the worker is only taking one at a time, the keli, the sal, a basket or a box or a kupa, the keli was mitzdaref, whatever that item is. So they were gathered together. The problem the Gemara will have is the muktzah. By the way, muktzah here means a pile. I know muktzah can mean, man, there's muktzah for Shabbos. Then we had the word muktzah, liktzois, to dry something out. That's something else, spread out to dry it out. Here, muktzah means a pile. Problem that the Gemara has initially is that a pile, how is the pile combined? There's no keli that's combining it. The worker is only taking one at a time. That's the Gemara's kash. It says in the Mishnah, moitze payala v'chulei. Guys, you remember, chulei v'chulei. If you have a vav before, same thing with the v'goymed. V'goymed is for Tanakh. If it's from Chazal, we go from v'chulei. It both means etc., just a different word. And if there's a vav before, the ikir is what comes later. And which is what's happening over here. The Gemara is referring to the words that the Gemara doesn't bring. And which are the words v'loy min hamuktzah. So the Gemara says, Nichal, that even if the worker is taking one at a time, but he's taking it from a basket, from a sal, or from a kupa, the Mishnah says he's not allowed to do that because they were combined. The chefza of the produce was combined in the chefza of the basket or the box. But why does the Mishnah say v'loy min hamuktzah? Why not? Part of the kasha now. Come on, just like we will have in a Mishnah and Daf Chav Ches in our pagination, where the Mishnah says regarding this guy, the worker who's eating figs only because of his own negotiations. Malakad achas v'oichel, only ve'im tzeidav chayev. Okay, so the kasha is why would we not say the same thing over here? How are they combined? He's only taking one at a time. Answers the Gemara, Amei Rabbi Yitzchak, Muksa Asu Oisoi Kimitzoidov. You're right that objectively it's not combined, it's in a pile. We treat it as if it's combined. Now, why would we treat it? He's not saying, no, you have to know how to learn the Yerushalmi. Muksa Asu Oisoi Kimitzoidov. What Rabbi Yitzchak is acknowledging the premise of the one who asked. It's not called combined. We are being machmer, we will rule as if. Why? Why Rabbi Yitzchak doesn't say? So the Achronim here give various suggestions. I want to share one. And I know a few people, I don't see Aviv, but a few people already asked, how do you define aray and keva by eating? What's the definition? It's not going to be so simple. Okay? Let me say the following. When you have a pile of food and you're taking one from it, it looks like you're planning to eat the whole pile. And there is a concept of quantity, not only quantity, but there is a quantity aspect to the criteria of aray and keva, that if it's very little, it's called a snack. At some point, it's called keva, so to do with the quantity of eating. By the way, we have the same thing when it comes to whether you have to make, even when you have made paytas, making a dough, and therefore theoretically certain items only demand a mazoinus and not a hamoitzi. If you're having a meal, we are machmed and we make hamoitzi. How do you define a meal? Some of it has to do with quantity, just for the record. Same thing over here. So there's a logic that when a person has a large pile of muktzah, the observer who looks at me, the worker, taking one, he might think that my kavana is I made this huge pile and I'm going to eat through the pile. So it looks like achilas keva. And guys, make no mistake, everything we're talking about, someone made a joke a few weeks ago that this masechta should be called masechta snacking. Because we keep on learning all of these dinim, whether you're chayiv, whether you're pater, You're never allowed to eat achilas kava before being toidem u'ma'asid, ever. Everything, mamash, we're daf chav gimel already. Everything we're learning about is, even though you didn't take up the tithings, you can snack until a certain point. So it has to do with, it looks like achilas kava, which is why the chachamim were machmir. And again, asu oisai kimitzarif. I like that shot, and let's go by it. Then the Mishnah gave another example that you have the same thing. You have a worker. The worker is working with olive trees. Again, it must be a case where he's not biblically entitled. And the Mishnah says that again, even though he's only eating because of his work, his negotiation, yes, mekach, he can only eat. He eats one at a time, but not two at a time. These are the words of the Gemara now. Oichel achas achas upata. That's concerning the case of the olives, the second case of the Mishnah. So now the Gemara says, hold on, there is a Braisa that argues with the Mishnah. Who is the Tana? Tana the Vei Rebbe. Tana, just for the record, Tana the Vei Rebbe, we're not calling Shitas Rebbe. That means in the Vei Rebbe, or the base Rebbe, that means in the yeshiva of Rebbe, they had a Masoida, they had a Braisa that had no author. So it's called Tana the Vei Rebbe. In the Braisa, it says that by the olives, even if the worker is going to take two or more at a time, he will still be allowed to snack. He doesn't have to make this effort of only eating one at a time. Clearly, by the case of the olives, there is a machlokes tanoim, our Mishnah versus the Braisa. Now, we want to really limit this machlokes, and we will successfully do so. It's going to be a huge chiddush that after learning so many times about this rule, mekach is kriveya, but not if it's achas achas. The moment it's shtayim tseiruf, we had that concept so many times, mitamol from left field. In the case of the olives, well, if the Vei Rebbe would argue on the whole concept of tseiruf, then they should argue by olives, by figs, by everything. So the Gemara limits their argument. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Yoina, let's clarify. It was not just an inquiry, he was clarifying. Man non kaimin. Where do we have this machlokes? What is the case of the Braisa and the Mishnah? Where are they arguing? If it's a normal case where you hired workers to pick olives, guys, that's what we learned in the last Pedic, that whenever a worker is entitled biblically to eat, one of the pshat in the pasuk is that you are allowed to snack. You don't have to be ma'aseh. It's not called mekach. And indeed, kol alma moida. Everyone agrees. So that can't be the case of the Mishnah. When our Mishnah says only oichal achas achas. So the example that we gave, we'll give it again, is that he's not working to pick. He's not harvesting. He was working to work under the tree. He's, let's say, hoeing under the tree. That gives him no entitlement. That's called mekach. Here again, the Gemara says, thank God, it's just a limiting. We're not making everything into a machlokes. Kol alma moide, that since midoiraisa he has no such right to eat. Shu oichel achas achas. Only when he eats one at a time is he potter, because really there is mekach. Elomai mekach is koveya when there is a combination. Only the imtziraf, then you're going to be chayiv. That's good. Okay, so where do they argue? So where is there an argument? So the Gemara says something beautiful, and it's going to actually fit with the Mishnah. Ella, zok the Gemara, kinan kaimin. What are we talking about? Listen to this, my friends. You hire a worker to weed the olives. What is weeding? Weeding is where you remove the psilus. Normally, the weeds are not the product themselves. Vadai, a worker that's hired to weed the weeds out of the ground, has no biblical right to eat anything. Here we're speaking about someone that has an olive tree. Some of the olives are developing in an inferior way. Now you have to be a farmer. It's to the benefit of the balabas to remove, to harvest the inferior olives. So you are really harvesting the olives, but your intention is not because you want to eat them. Your intention is because when you take off the bad ones, the good ones will have more nourishment from the tree. The good ones will have more room. And there's going to be at the end some benefit to the balabas, even if you were to throw those inferior olives away. He doesn't need them. But understand, my friends, the worker was actually hired to pick the olives. So the machlokes between the Braisa and the Mishnah is the biblical entitlement given to a worker that's working in a field to harvest produce, does it apply to this case or does it not apply to this case? That's the machlekes between Tana the Rebbe and our Mishnah, which is beautiful. According to our Mishnah, he has no biblical entitlement because the kavana of the owner was not for him to pick some of the olives because the owner wants those olives. The mitzvah, the owner, this olives is like weeds. And therefore, even though he negotiated his right to eat, that was his negotiation. Mekach, tseiruf, koiveya. So our Mishnah says, only oichel achas upater. Tana the Rebbe holds that since at the end of the day, this guy is harvesting olives, Hashem gives him the right to eat. The fact that he needed to negotiate, that was from his ignorance. Really, he could have leaned on the biblical entitlement. That's exactly what we learned in the beginning of the Sugya in the Mishnah, that even though the guy made his own negotiation, if Hashem already gave him the right, then it's not called Mekach. Since it's not called Mekach, oichel kedarkoi, beautiful.
But since it cannot be harvested, is it considered food? Low quality?
So in other words, what Kevin is pointing out is that one thing we see, that these olives are not considered non-food. If they would be considered non-food, then you can even eat them achilas keva. It is considered food. Okay, very good. Good point. Says the Gemara that you, Rabbi Yoina, you're so right. Because the Mishnah gave three cases. The first case, that we just learned. The Mishnah gave the case of the olives, and then the Mishnah gave the case of the onions. And just for the record, the case of the onions is mamish this case. We're speaking about a worker that was hired to uproot stunted onions. The Mishnah uses the words lenakesh b'psalim. So says the Gemara, good gezag, Ming de Basra, Rabbi Yoina can prove his understanding from the next case of the Mishnah. When the Mishnah says, the third case, that if you hire a worker lenakesh b'psalim, which mamish means just that you're uprooting onions, but you're calling it nikush. Nikush means to eat, because those onions are stunted, and removing them from the ground will allow the other ones to grow bigger, to grow better. And what does the Mishnah say? Our Mishnah holds, the worker says, well, I'm only going to work on the condition that I get to eat the green leaves on the onion plant. And the Mishnah also says, only oichel achas achas. Only oichel achas achas is because our Mishnah holds that we don't view him as someone who has any biblical entitlement. Why not? Because he was not hired to harvest a produce that the owner wants. He was hired to harvest produce that the owner doesn't want. So the Mishnah said there also, the concept is that what is the combination? He's eating the green leaves. So he can only pick one leaf at a time. But if you pick two leaves at a time, then he's going to be chayiv. So just like the case of the Tzalim is that he's hired to remove the onions. But why is he not biblically entitled? Because the owner doesn't want him. So learn the same shot with the olives, not hoeing under the tree. He was hired to be menakesh, right? Lenakesh bezeisim. Okay, now we have another couple of minutes. So this is going to be beautiful. Even though some achronim somehow make the next piece of the Gemara fit behemshach to what we're learning right now, we're going to go with the majority opinion, and this is something that happens on occasion in the Yerushalmi. It wasn't as learned as, and therefore there are mistakes that were not fixed. And it's beautiful that look how cautious we are to change anything. We're leaving the Gemara in here on Daf Chav Gimel Amid Beis, Pei Gimel Halacha Aleph, but we will learn the whole pshat of what we're going to be learning forward, that this is going to be a biur, a Gemara, an explanation on a Mishnah that we're going to have on Daf Chavav, the Mishnah, which we'll call Halacha Beis. Again, the rule that if you find figs on the side of a fig field, even if there are figs spread out all over the field, or if you find figs underneath a fig tree, imagine you find a fig underneath a fig tree. Zok the Mishnah, mutara is mishum gezel. The finder can keep it. It's not called gezel, and you can snack. Upatura is min ha'maiser. That is the words of the Mishnah. So now let's begin. We'll just begin. Rab Chagai shal lechavrai. Rab Chagai learned the Mishnah, and he asked his chaverim, ahon patur ditaninan hachi, which means why he's not focusing on the gezel, he's focusing on the paturas min ha'maiser. Why? Based on what? And here again, now clearly the Gemara is opening up the topic of the definition of arai. Here, my friends, it's not about quantity, it's about where you are eating it. We're going to just learn the top line in Chavdalad, and then God willing, we'll continue in the next year. So the Chavraya tells Rab Chagai the reason why they are Perturas Min HaMaaseh is Mishum Oichal Arai Basada V'hu Pater. The way we're going to teach it is that how do we define Keva and Arai? I know we just mentioned at times we look at the quantity of foods, which is not wrong. Here we are looking at the location. Look inside the top Marafulda. Amrulei Mishum Oichal Basada. It says the Marafulda, the Ein Derech Lechol Basada. People don't have what we call a meal, a Su'udas Keva or Achilas Keva. People don't have it in the field. The location implies Ela Havalei Arai. And why is that important? Clearly here, not quantity. Afilu Oichel Harbe, that means that even if a person eats a lot in the field, Arayu. It's like you can say, if you have a chef and he's working in the kitchen, and while he's preparing food, some of these people, they eat a lot. They can eat a lot. Keva is when you eat in the dining room. Keva is where you eat on the kitchen table. In other words, in the makayim that was designated, when you are eating the makayim that you're making the food, it just makes everyone feel that it's achilas arei. This is a very big yisoid. And let's read the Maraful. I'm finishing the Maraful. Masnisin, the matzah ketzios. This Gemara, according to them, according to almost everyone, it's not connected to halacha aleph. This is already halacha beis, koi, and this conversation between Rab Chagai and the Bnei Yeshiva, because guys, we're going to continue back. That he don't think Rab Chagai liked that explanation, but that was their vart. The vart is that guys, also make no mistake. If there's an iyas pnei bias, okay, if there's any echad mishisha devarim, you can't snap. Let's make it clear. You're not merchandising these figs. You're growing it there. Eating in the field, that's the vart of this Mishnah, by itself defines the meal as arai. And therefore, that's what the Mishnah says. Upaturas min ha'maisres. And we're going to see how Rab Chagai rejected this understanding. A lot more to be continued. I do want to throw out that due to the fact that my flight is during the time of the class, so we're not going to learn Friday. We're going to pick up, God willing, next week. Everyone should have a gavaldik day.
Shabbos that way.
Shabbos to everyone.
Shabbos.
Gavaldik. Opa.